afternoon, welcome to The Ambassador. Today, we'll be tackling a topic that affects most of our African countries, that is leadership. From Ethiopia's Tigray crisis and the M23 rebellion in the Democratic Republic of Congo to the ongoing turmoil in Libya, Somalia, and Nigeria, one thing is clear: despite years of diplomacy, peace remains out of reach. So, the big question is Africa facing a failure of diplomacy, or is it bad governance at the root of these conflicts? In many of these nations, leaders hold on to power for decades, using state resources to crush opposition and weaken institutions. At the same time, regional bodies like the African Union and the ECOWAS struggle to keep things together. Are they actually helping, or are they just part of the problem? Today, we are breaking it all down: how leadership, governance, and diplomacy shape African conflicts, and most importantly, what can be done to turn things around. What reforms are needed? How can leaders and institutions build lasting peace? But first, let's see the top stories making headlines here at The Ambassador, where we debunk global diplomacy and geopolitics. I am your Ambassador Susan Nganga. Now to the latest. The ongoing crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo is shedding light on the struggle of its military, as soldiers face trials for crimes committed and fleeing a rebel offensive, as the army grapples with poor pay, corruption, and weakening command structures. The country's leadership is under increasing pressure to address the chaos in the east. Here's more on that story.
Democratic Republic of Congo, the trial of several Congolese soldiers has drawn attention to the severe dysfunction within the country's military. Soldiers are facing charges including rape and murder for alleged crimes committed as they retreated from a swift and brutal rebel advance by the Rwanda-backed M23 rebels.
We were trying to find our unit, and when we got to Kimbulu, we settled in the street. That's where we were apprehended. We explained that we were looking for our unit, and it was on our way back that we were arrested. That's the end of the story. We didn't steal. We didn't do anything wrong. We are innocent.
The situation in the east of the country has worsened in recent weeks as M23 rebels continue to gain ground. Despite President Felix Tshisekedi's claims of efforts to recruit new soldiers and acquire weapons, many soldiers on the front lines have expressed frustration over being poorly equipped and underpaid. The president has blamed military leaders for the army's poor performance, accusing them of betrayal from within. However, critics of Tshisekedi have questioned his reliance on regional forces, mercenaries, and militias, arguing that these groups have proven difficult to control and have contributed to the instability. Rwanda, which has been accused of backing the M23 rebels, denies providing them with arms or troops. As Congo continues to lose territory to M23 forces, the situation within its military remains precarious, leaving the nation vulnerable and its leadership under increasing scrutiny. Reporting for GBS News, Irene Juguna.
Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company announced a historic investment of at least $100 billion to expand its operation in the United States. The move, unveiled by President Donald Trump at the White House, is part of a larger push to boost United States manufacturing, particularly in the crucial semiconductor industry. Here's more on that.
Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company has announced a $100 billion investment to expand its U.S. operations, including the construction of 3 new chip-making fabrication plants, 2 advanced packaging facilities, and a research center. This brings Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company's total U.S. investments to $165 billion and is expected to create tens of thousands of jobs.
This $100 billion in new investment will go into building 5 cutting-edge fabrication facilities in the great state that we just discussed, Arizona, and will create thousands of jobs, many thousands of jobs, and high-paying jobs. In total, today's announcement brings Taiwan Semiconductor investments to about $165 billion they've started already.
The announcement made by President Donald Trump underscores the importance of boosting U.S. chip-making capabilities amid national security concerns and growing competition from China. Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company's expansion will focus on supporting AI and smartphone advancements, with key customers such as Apple and Nvidia backing the move. The U.S. government, particularly through the former President's Chips and Science Act, has incentivized this investment, signaling a major push to reduce the reliance on foreign chip manufacturers.
We must be able to build the chips and semiconductors that we need right here in American factories with American skill and American labor. And that's exactly what we're doing. As you know, Taiwan pretty much has a monopoly on that market. And I think pretty much is not a term that's even appropriate. They do have a monopoly, and this is a tremendous move by the most powerful company in the world.
This announcement follows similar moves from other tech giants like Apple and Oracle, further emphasizing the trend of investing in U.S. infrastructure. Despite some setbacks with earlier projects like Foxconn's investment in Wisconsin, Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company's plans are seen as a significant development for the U.S. tech sector and its future in the global chip market. Teresa Tiengo, GBS News.
The United Nations World Food Programme, a critical organization fighting hunger globally, is closing its Southern African office due to financial limitation. The shutdown comes amid significant cuts in foreign aid from the United States government, which traditionally provides nearly half of the World Food Programme's annual funding. Irene Juguna reports.
The World Food Programme WFP has announced the closure of its Southern African office as a result of ongoing financial constraints. The United States, which has long been a major donor to the organization, is scaling back foreign aid under President Donald Trump's America First policy, contributing to the funding shortfall. Thomson Ferry, a regional spokesperson for WFP, confirmed that while the South African office will shut down, operations in the region will continue. The WFP is merging its Eastern and Southern African divisions, now to be managed from Nairobi, Kenya. Despite the reduction in funding, Ferry emphasized that the WFP will continue to maximize resources to support its frontline operations, ensuring that aid reaches those in need. With the U.S. slashing more than 90% of foreign aid contracts under the Trump administration, the WFP's financial challenges are expected to continue, with over $58 billion in overall United States assistance being reduced worldwide. As Southern Africa struggles with drought and food shortages, the WFP's decision reflects the broader impact of shifting U.S. foreign aid priorities, highlighting the critical need for continued support for humanitarian efforts across the globe. Reporting for GBS News, Irene Juguna.
The Israel government has indefinitely suspended the entry of aid materials in Gaza. This comes after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accuses Hamas of stealing aid materials. Israeli government spokesperson David Mencer stated that Hamas are hoarding aid materials that fuel obesity epidemic within the group. However, Reds Group have stated that the suspension of aid will cause another starvation crisis. Abi Hamid Ali has more on that scene.
As the sunset gleams in the Mediterranean coastline in Gaza, Palestinians are eager to continue fasting for the holy month of Ramadan. However, Palestinians will have another difficult Ramadan after the Israeli government has halted aid materials like food, clean water, medicines, and mobile homes to enter the enclave. The Israeli government has accused the Hamas militant group of hoarding and stealing aid material. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had this to say.
Israel has decided to stop letting goods and supplies into Gaza, something we've done for the past 42 days. We've done that because Hamas steals the supplies and prevents the people of Gaza from getting them. It uses these supplies to finance its terror machine, which is aimed directly at Israel and our civilians, and this we cannot accept. We will take further steps if Hamas continues to hold our hostages.
While the Israeli government spokesperson David Mencer accused Hamas of fueling an obesity epidemic within the group.
The sworn goal of Hamas is to kill every Jew on earth. And so what? You want Israel to pay for their petrol, to make them sandwiches as well? Hamas have hoarded for months and months of supplies. They have enough food to fuel an obesity epidemic. But the only people we see getting fat are Hamas themselves.
Rights groups such as Médecins Sans Frontières have warned that the suspension of aid will cause another starvation crisis in the enclave that is inhabitable, while the Gaza government media office told Palestinians that enough food is available in the market for the next 2 weeks. Rights groups such as Norwegian Refugee Council have considered to stop shipments of aid due to Israeli blocking aid trucks from entering the enclave. As a result, the shipping and storing perishable aid in warehouses is costly for the group. The situation in Gaza continues to remain critical. Is Israel violating another international law from barring a group of indigenous people from accessing aid? How will it affect Palestinian Muslims who are practicing fasting during the holy month of Ramadan? Only time will tell. This is Abdihamid Ali, GBS News.
The Trump administration has paused all military aid to Ukraine after clashing with Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House. However, Trump has stated that he is more open to sign a mineral deal with Ukraine. While European leaders formulated a ceasefire proposal, majority of whom are seeking support from the United States. Abdihamid Ali has more.
The Trump administration has halted military aid to Ukraine. The U.S. used to provide military aid worth billions of dollars to Ukraine in a conflict with Russia that has lasted for 3 years. Trump stated that Zelensky should be more appreciative and Europe should provide more aid to Ukraine.
Well, I just think he should be more appreciative because this country has stuck with them through thick and thin. We've given them much more than Europe, and Europe should have given more than us because, as you know, that's right there, that's the border. This country really was like the fence on the border. It was very important to Europe, and I'm not knocking Europe. I'm saying that just they were a lot smarter than Joe Biden because Joe Biden didn't have a clue. He just gave money hand over fist.
The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer hosted European leaders to formulate a proposal to end the war in Ukraine that will guarantee US support and security in Ukraine. France proposed a ceasefire plan that will pause the conflict for a month as a way to open doors for negotiation talks. A mineral deal was supposed to be signed last week, but a verbal clash between the two leaders has jeopardized the deal. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer stated that the mineral deal lacks sufficient means to deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again.
The mineral deal is not enough. Zelensky is a war leader whose country has been invaded. And we should all be supporting him and not fawning over Putin.
Zelensky posted on social media stating that Ukrainians want a peace deal to end the war and a security guarantee, and hopes for the US support to guarantee peace in the war-torn country. The newly elected German Chancellor Friedrich Merz stated that the infamous verbal clash between Trump and Zelensky was planned beforehand to trap Zelensky.
Nach meiner Einschätzung was not a spontaneous reaction to interventions by Zelensky, but obviously a manufactured escalation.
The war between Russia and Ukraine has caused a diplomatic crisis and divisions between the US and Europe. Russia praised Trump for the US changing its stance on the 3-year war. Now Zelensky lacks future military aid needed to deter Russia. Ukraine's future remains in the dark, and without the US support, Russia will gain the upper hand in the conflict that defines the 21st century. This is Abdihamid Ali, GBS News.
And that's all for now on our current segment. We'll be back after this break for the African In-Depth. Stay tuned.
How is it for you as a parent? Are you having an adolescent? How is parenting for you?
But again, we have to be fair, firm, and friendly. We cannot parent without being friendly to these children. It's peer pressure not to be pure. Where the adolescents, they have a slogan, Mavajuni Fara. Parents, you have to be hot, raw, real, and nice.
How do we help our children to understand we are not from the West and we can never be the West? The reason as to why I'm bringing this out is because
we have to understand the trends. Because they tend to trade with what is trading. We have to be able to understand and tell our children, just because it is trading doesn't make it a trade.
Let's continue this conversation online across all our social media networks. That's GBS TV Africa. Our SMS line is 21144.
Hello kids, did you know a year has 31,557,600 seconds? Why do you think so? Exactly. There are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, and 365 and 25 days in a year. We count the extra 0.25 because of leap year. When you multiply all these numbers together, you get a huge number of seconds. That's why a year feels long, the time still flies when you are having fun.
How can I start the missionary school? And God was giving me the heart to start the missionary school. In 1972, my most beautiful daughter was born. And I didn't raise my daughter, so God raised my daughter, so she was raised so wonderfully to work for the gospel. And so 1976, the missionary school was born. And I feel so moved as the church is moving for the gospel. The pastor lives for this.
What is always before you but can't be seen?
Kudiscover talent.
Kudiscover ulijuangaje like unaweza imba like yeah.
Kini Trace Jumi Kipchoge kwa ngoma na mfala wananidis na wanabonga kwa ngoma, mafanjo wananipenda ndo nazidi kwa roga, wenye walenjaribu mazee walishachoka na nikozabe meditation naendelesha generation niliofanya kalki.
Wewe at 1 year old ulikuwa unafanya nini? You're feeling the vibe. Ulitoa a few days ago, unaweza taka utuambie like ulikuwa unafikiria nini when you came up with the lyrics? Yeah.
So I'm doing my thing. Don't try and stop me when I'm doing my thing. I'm trying to boss, let me do my thing. And if you're trying to win, you can be on my team. Yeah, so I'm doing my thing. Don't try and stop me when I'm doing my thing. I'm trying to boss, let me do my thing.
You feel like you're young at heart, I'm an old soul. If you could only listen to one singer or band for the rest of your life, who will you choose?
And the question of the day is, can you survive without internet?
Hii ni kama kuambia mtu mwenye alikuwa amezoea kushindana nguo, mwambie kwa nguo ushinda uchi. Hiyo ya kiwiki sababu sasa, lakini kwa imekimbia kwa kichwa kabisa.
Sasa inaweza kaka holi ya bila simu.
Kuspend most of the time kwa simu. Also you need to run skills. So nilipata na place hapa nikapo apply huko. Then I started running skills. Digital skills.
Wiki naachilia hata kama ni siku mbili ama sometimes na extend tu wiki mzima. Napata shiki simu yangu.
And the question of the day is, Can you survive without internet?
Plus kachile ile story tu zote zikupite ni ngori. Mwambie ukweli. Like hii ni kama kuambia mtu mwenye alikuwa amezoea kushinda na nguo, mwambie kwa nguo ushinda uchi. Ya kiiki kwa sababu sasa like ilikuwa imekimbia kwa kichwa kabisa.
Sasa inaweza kaka holi ya bila simu.
Kuspend most of the time kwa simu. Also you need to run skills. So nilipata na place hapa nikapotea huko. Then I started learning skills. Digital skills. Yes, I just continue wiki naachiliwa hata kama ni siku mbili ama sometimes na extend tu wiki mzima. Napata shiki simu yangu.
Welcome back to the bulletin now. As promised earlier, on our analysis here at African In-Depth, we will focus on the leadership in the conflict-prone countries. Governments in the conflict-prone countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and Somalia face immense leadership challenges that hinder stability, development, and governance. One of the most foremost challenges is the weak institutional framework caused by years of instability, corruption, and power struggles. In this nation, governance structures are often fragile, lacking the capacity to enforce laws, provide basic services, and maintain a functioning economy. But before we welcome our analyst, let's hear first for our very own Peris Kigo with our report.
Government in conflict-prone countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and Somalia face immense leadership challenges that hinder stability, development, and governance. Weak institutions caused by years of instability, corruption, and power struggles make it difficult to enforce laws, provide basic services, and maintain a functioning economy. This power vacuum allows warlords, militants, and extremist groups to thrive, further eroding governmental authority and legitimacy. Ethnic and political division also fuel ongoing conflicts, making national unity difficult. In Sudan and Somalia, historical grievances and tribal rivalries create deep mistrust in central government. While in the Democratic Republic of Congo, ethnic militias fight over resource-rich territories. Economic instability worsens the situation, as corruption and illicit resource exploitation prevent development. External influences further complicate governance, as foreign nations and regional actors pursue competing interests, leading to proxy conflicts and conditional aid. Addressing these challenges requires strong political will, inclusive governance, economic reform, and international cooperation to break the cycle of violence and instability. Peris Kigo, GBS News.
To help us unpack this complex issue, we are honored to have two distinguished guests in the studio. Joining us is Dr. Josh Mayo, an expert in international relations and political affairs, and Victor Machoka, a PhD candidate in international relations from USIU Africa. First, I'll first welcome them to introduce themselves. Welcome so much.
Well, thank you for having us again today. It's a pleasure to be here. I think probably your viewers are now familiar with me right now. But yes, so I teach international relations. I have studied international relations, development, and African politics for the last 30 years or so.
Yes.
And I'm happy to share some of the insights that I have.
Welcome so much.
Thank you.
Our next guest.
Thank you very much. I'm passionate about leadership. In addition to what you've talked about, I'm a PhD candidate in international relations, but my passion area is leadership. I've over 20 years of leadership in various areas, in entrepreneurship, and also I'm a leadership coach in governance.
Welcome to the Ambassador.
Thank you.
Now we'll start off this conversation by asking a most common question, Dr. Rick. Is there a failure in diplomacy in Africa?
Well, that's an interesting question. Diplomacy has various dimensions, right? So there is internal diplomacy within states, and there is external diplomacy between states. And so when we're talking about conflict, which is the context of our discussion today,
Yes.
is that charity begins at home. So ideally it is up to leaders within a state as the first attempt to deal with conflict issues. And so leaders should therefore, are expected to operate within constitutional means that provide diplomatic avenues for resolving conflicts without necessarily resorting to violence. So obviously when violence occurs, it means that peaceful means where diplomacy comes in has failed. The next step would be then external attempts from outsiders who are concerned about conflict and the risks to citizens inside these countries affected by conflict to attempt to mediate. Often because of the failure of local parties to come to a mutually agreed consensus. So then the outsiders come in with different tools for diplomacy. Sometimes you have threats of sanctions and so on and so forth. And so we see, generally speaking, on the African continent that what we see mostly is external diplomatic attempts to resolve conflicts. We don't see too much of internal processes, because only when internal processes are failed, then the international community becomes aware and becomes involved. So it will be interesting to see the relationship between both internal and external diplomacy, yes.
Thank you so much. So Victor, from your point of view, has diplomacy failed?
Well, I think you also have to look at the different dynamics of diplomacy.
Yes.
You know, there is hard diplomacy, there is soft diplomacy. And from a leadership standpoint, I see diplomacy as a tool most of the time, especially in the context we're talking about, that is used to resolve issues. So the bigger question is not how did they resolve the issues, is why do these issues keep coming up? Why do we have this conflict that requires very difficult diplomatic resolutions? Why do we have issues in governance within the African states that present such a heavy challenge for the diplomatic corps? So I think that's the more serious issue that Africa is facing.
And why do we have conflict in Africa?
Wow, how much time do you have? That's a massive question. It's a fantastic question, and unfortunately it doesn't have a single answer. There are many challenges that African countries face, beginning all the way from legacy issues, from the post-colonial period, even before the colonial emancipation. There are challenges when we were going through the colonial period. That 50, 100-year period impacted our people. You have to look and ask yourself, do we have the right leaders that help us navigate through the challenges that we're facing? Because it's not about the roughness of the sea, it's do we have the right people to help us navigate through them? And I think what we really face is a leadership challenge.
If I can chip in very, very quickly.
Yes.
There are various theories that explain the occurrence and persistence of conflict, particularly on the African continent. And just before we came in, I was trying to think through what are some of the different types of conflicts that we have. So some of the theoretical explanations say that some conflicts are a result of identity. Many African states are composed of multiple ethnicities within them that have strong identity within themselves, and they have a weak sense of nationhood, right? So they have a weak national identity. So these ethnicities or these identities are conflicting against each other. The other one is governance issues. So there are conflicts that arise as a result of grievances, of bad governance, so certain sections of society feel excluded or marginalized or persecuted, which result in conflict. Some conflicts are primarily the result of elite fallout. So it's not about the citizens, it's not about ethnic groups or clans and tribes, it is about the leaders themselves falling out from among themselves, primarily because of greed greed for power, and they are unable to come to a compromise for that. And then, of course, we have resource-driven conflicts. Usually the onset is different. It could be greed, identity, ethnicity, grievances, but then eventually it is perpetuated because of the presence of resources. And then overall, we have state fragility. When states are weak, the governance institutions and mechanisms for resolving issues, for distributing resources, for everybody to feel that they have an equal and fair chance in society. When we have weak states, when we have fragile states, these institutions fail. And then you have the law of the jungle, and that's where violence comes in. So there are multiple facets to conflicts in Africa.
African leaders are often seen that they strive in weak institutions, in weak political institutions. Is this true?
Yes, to a large extent. African states suffer from weak institutions, by and large. And so going way back to, as Victor said, to the immediate post-independence period, one of the biggest challenges of African leaders was setting up institutions of the state that would take over from the colonial administration. And so the legacy of continuous weak institutions, and sometimes how these leaders have played with these institutions to serve their interests, some of them actually deliberately weaken institutions so as to enhance the personalization of power. When you have weak institutions, power is personalized. So people rule by decree, people rule by influence and patronage and so on and so forth, which serves the interest of the leaders in power. And so, generally speaking, yes, weak institutions is one of the major challenges.
And Victor, we see a lot of African leaders hold on to power. They don't want to relinquish power. So how has this impacted the African conflicts?
I think it's interesting whenever we look at the length of an African leader's tenure as a measure of how good the quality of governance is in that state. There are many democratic states where there is a peaceful transition of power, and yet that state is failing, that state is struggling. So the question is, why is it that most of the African leaders hold on to power? I know the common theory is greed and clientelism and all that, but you also have to look at the traditional roots. In our tradition, in African tradition, most of the leaders were lifelong leaders. Most of the leadership was hereditary. And you see now we are transitioning from our African leadership culture and coming into the democratic system which was bequeathed to us by the West. So I think there's also a bit of inertia. There's a bit of reluctance to transition into this Western model of leadership. I think also many of the states that we have, especially post-independence, as Prof has said, were fragile states. And it's very difficult to build a nation from scratch. You're building a nation that you just got 5 years ago. You're setting up the legal system, you're setting up fiscal policy and all these things. And within 5 years, you have to prepare for elections. So I think there's a bit of a challenge when a leader is forced to leave their work prematurely, so to speak, and allow somebody else with different interests to come in and take over and build that nation. So I think aside also from the greed and the selfish interest, I think a number of our leaders actually love the country too much to let go. And I know that's a bit controversial. But I've seen that. If you look at Rwanda, for instance, I think we cannot deny that President Kagame loves his nation. And when you travel to Rwanda, you can actually feel the passion of the government for the people. Now, how that transition happens eventually is a puzzle for all of us.
So how long should a president stay in power?
I think this is a question that the people should answer. Did the people decide that it should be 5 years initially? Did the African people decide? There have been scholars who have stated that the problem with democracy is we are constantly in elections. So you find that 1 year you're campaigning for an election. After that election, it takes 1 year to settle down. In 3 years, you're campaigning again. So some scholars are actually proposing 7, 10-year terms so that governments can be able to settle down and actually follow through what they're doing. One last final challenge is when you set up a policy as government, most of the important policies will take effect 5, 6, 7, 8, even 10 years after. When you look at our education system, when you look at our security infrastructure, you will begin to feel the effects long after the political cycle. So you find the credit or the damage goes to the succeeding regime. And so most of the political outfits tailor their ideas to short-term political plans. You find we have got 3-year plans, 4-year plans, maximum 5-year plans, and that doesn't build the nation.
Do you agree, Dr. Lee?
There is a lot of credence to that short-termism, that politicians govern for elections rather than govern in the long-term interest of the state. And some have argued that the Mexico model is actually quite interesting because they changed their constitution so that a presidential period is 7 years and it's only 1 term. So presidents cannot be re-elected. They cannot run for office again. So that frees the president for that period of 7 years to do their best to govern in the interest of the country rather than calculating how they will win the next election. We have a situation in Kenya where some argue that we are now already in election mode because the president is trying to move the chessboard, right, to see what is the best possible combination for him to win the next election, and that all political, economic, and policy decisions are now being made towards winning an election rather than governing in the interest of the country. And so, yes, the same way, because I'm a specialist in development studies as well, is that most development programs are designed with a very short period of time, within 3 to 5 years, right? But to change society requires longer thinking, long-term thinking, 10, 15, 20, even 50-year plans to change society. So the question then is, so this is the challenge of democracy and short-term governance periods, that it is not designed for a more long-term strategic thinking in the interest of the state, but rather it works in the interest of politicians.
Okay, so Victor, we saw regional blocs. We saw 3 countries exit ECOWAS. Yeah, we saw Guinea-Bissau recently threatened to expel the ECOWAS mission in the country. How do regional blocs play a role in the conflict, in escalating, or how do they make the conflict go away?
I think regional blocs, the principle behind regional blocs is for them to aggregate opinion and put pressure on a state or a government that is misbehaving, so to speak. So when a government of a particular state is called by this regional bloc, which consists of like 5, 10 states, and they're telling them this is the direction you need to go, the goal of that regional bloc is to put economic or political pressure on them so that they can do the right thing. But you see, the challenge again is these regional blocs, do they really aggregate the opinions and the desires of Africans? Or do they actually communicate the opinions of other parties? Because we've seen situations where the opinions, I remember when there was the issue in Israel, between Israel and Palestine, and we had South Africa standing up and saying this is unacceptable. So South Africa is able to express its personal opinion, or rather its opinion as a state, but why is it not able to express that through the African Union in the same way? So you find the regional blocs sometimes are also fragmented, and because they're fragmented, they are not able to actually understand what this state is going through. So in the situation of ECOWAS, the feeling is, does ECOWAS really represent our views? Where was ECOWAS when we were subjugated post-independence for the past 60 years? Those are the pertinent questions that the presidents in the Sahel region are asking. Where were you when we were struggling to be free from French governance and economic subjugation? Where were you? So now that we have expelled the French, we are changing our currency, we have taken over our governments, now you want to tell us how we are going to do that. And so the blocs lose their legitimacy. They lose their right to tell these states what to do when from the beginning they are not communicating what these states actually want. So I feel that we need a redesign of our regional blocs. the leadership and the understanding in there should be pro-African. We need to find a way to expel the interests of the West or any other region from that regional bloc, so that the people that are speaking in there are actually the members of that region. And if they do that, then they have the right to tell one of their members, hey, this is what you need to do.
So are they part of the problem, the regional blocs, Dr.
Interestingly,
yes,
the question that we can also reflect on is whether these regional blocs are actually African. The African Union office building in Addis was built as a gift by the Chinese. The East African Federation, the East African Community offices in Arusha were built by the Germans. Up to now, development partners subsidize a large percentage of the operating budget of the African Union as well as the East African Community. Many member states of these regional organizations do not actually fulfill their annual contributions, both to the African Union and to the East African Community. Many countries are in arrears. The last time when South Sudan was supposed to assume the leadership of the East African Community, they were embarrassed because of the dues that they owed. So they first had to clear a substantial amount of the dues that they owed in terms of their contributions before they could assume the chairmanship of the East African Community. So the question then is, are African states actually sufficiently invested in these regional blocs? And what powers do these regional blocs have? Many of these regional blocs are actually disempowered because the member states deliberately fail to give sufficient power because they don't want to cede sovereignty. They don't want to give power and authority to regional blocs to make certain decisions on behalf of the region because the leaders of these states want to maintain their influence. And so this partly contributes to why the regional blocs are inefficient and they don't rise up to the occasion.
Okay, we'll go for a short break, but we'll be right back.
How is it for you as a parent? Are you having an adolescent? How is parenting for you?
But again, we have to be fair, firm, and friendly. We cannot parent without being friendly to these children. Peer pressure not to be pure. Where the adolescents, they have a slogan, Mavajuni Fara. Parent, you have to be hot, raw, real, and nice.
How do we help our children to understand we are not from the West and we can never be the West? The reason as to I'm bringing this out is because
we have to understand the trends. Because they tend to trade with what is trading. We have to be able to understand and tell our children just because it is trading doesn't make it a trade.
Well, let's continue this conversation online across all our social media networks. That's GBS TV Africa. Our SMS line is 21144.
Hello, kids. Did you know a year has 31,557,600 seconds? Why do you think so? Exactly. There are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, and 365 and 25 days in a year. We count the extra 0.25 because of leap year. When you multiply all these numbers together, you get a huge number of seconds. That's why a year feels long, the time still flies when you are having fun.
Everywhere, GBS.
Welcome back to the bulletin. We are discussing about leadership in the conflict-prone areas. Now, Daktari, we come back to you. What leadership models or reforms could help break the cycle of conflicts?
Leadership models. It is difficult to think of a specific model that is effective. Political scientists do not often study leaders or even leadership. Many conflicts are understood to be a function of social issues, poverty, resources, institutions, ethnicity, identity, and so on and so forth. And very rarely is it understood that leaders actually play a role, all right? And so there is not enough studies that have been done to identify specific types of leadership models that, that work to prevent conflict arising. So instead of looking at leaders themselves, they talk about institutions. And the argument is that if you have strong independent institutions, the leaders are irrelevant. It doesn't matter who is the head of state or who is in charge of a country. If institutions are strong, if there is rule of law, if people respect institutions, if people feel that there is fairness in the system, right, there is less likelihood of conflict to arise. So if we were to talk about a leadership model, therefore, we would talk about a decentralized, liberal, democratic leadership where citizens feel included in the governance process, where citizens feel that their views and concerns are listened to, they are taken into account in decisions that are made in how they are governed, and that there is mutual respect between the state and the citizens. It's something known as the social contract between citizens and the state. Citizens have certain obligations, but the state also has obligations to citizens. It is when that social contract is broken, that trust between citizens and the state, that then things break down. And that's what we saw in Kenya during the Gen Z protests. It's what we saw in Sudan during the overthrow of al-Bashir, and the revolutions we saw in the Middle East a couple of years ago. So I think strong democratic institutions, inclusivity in governance would be a viable model that would diffuse tensions and reduce the likelihood of conflict.
So, Victor, Africa mostly we don't have a strong opposition. Does this lack of opposition impact conflicts? And why don't we have opposition?
I'm sorry, I'm still going to go back to the roots. You know, I feel like, and probably the benefit of my background is an insider-outsider view, because I think so many times we look at the model of the political environment as opposed to the intention of it. To your previous question, I like what Prof. Mayo said, because he's describing the outcome of what leadership looks like. So this is what good leadership looks like when it actually happens. But like in any company, you always want to figure out, okay, so how do I make sure it always happens? We normally skirt around the issue of the leader so many times. We talk about the impact of bad leadership. We talk about what good leadership looks like. We talk about why we should not have bad leaders. But nobody is actually asking, how do we make these good leaders? Where do they actually come from? We only discuss them when they come on the scene. So the biggest challenge we have in Africa is nobody questions the roots of this president or this head of state until they become elected. We don't have the conversation before this person comes into office. So the opposition, in my opinion, is an opportunity to check the leader. But if you have a bad leader, then the opposition is going to have a bad time anyway. If you have good leadership, then the opposition is going to have an easier time of putting that person to task. So yes, it is important to have an opposition. I think one of the pertinent conversations right now in Kenya is that we don't seem to have an opposition. It has been swallowed up by the government. The question is why? Because should we not have good leadership in the opposition as well? Because if you're going to, as a nation, develop a lot of good leaders, then you will end up with good leaders in the leadership, in the government. You'll end up with good leaders in opposition. You'll end up with people of character that have got the ability to abstain from being subsumed into the government, or they'll not keep shifting their stances. When you look at people in Kenya, for example, who have been considered to be in the opposition, you find that the same things they condemned, 1 month later, once they are invited into government, they are supporting the exact same thing. And yet they still retain the support of their constituents. So the people that supported that person and their ideologies when they were in opposition did not abandon that person when they came into government. So who do we blame? Because this person is a leader of people. So if his people followed him into opposition and as well followed him into government with completely different ideologies, then we don't have a problem with this guy. We have a problem with his sponsors. Why is it that his sponsors are comfortable equivocating from one ideal to another? And that's why I'm saying what we need to discuss is, what is leadership? Where are leaders made? When are we having the conversation about leadership? 13 years old, 25, 45, when I get into government, when I start working? If we have that conversation, we can now begin to develop a leadership quotient in the entire country. So that as a country, we can be able to say, no, this is bad. Regardless of who he says is good, this is bad. And I think that's the spirit of leadership. It's not an individual.
Actually, can you answer the questions?
Yes, I have a slightly different perspective. Now, one of the studies I've done in the past on going back to the question of the opposition, I wrote a master's thesis about 15 years ago that I said that Kenya's political parties, including opposition, they preach water but they drink wine. What do I mean by that? That when they are in the opposition, they champion democracy, inclusiveness, representation, fairness, and all that. The moment they go in power, in power, they completely change and govern differently. Secondly, the internal processes within these political parties, although on the outside they claim to be championing democracy, but if you look at the way that they function internally, they're actually very autocratic systems. You will have a party leader who is a party leader forever in perpetuity. I think you know who we are talking about in Kenya. They have, even if they hold elections of party, the other offices change, but the party leader never changes. So how democratic is that? Okay, how democratic is the process of even selecting party candidates to go on the ballot? People actually buy those positions, right? So political parties themselves, even those in the opposition, are undemocratic. So how do we expect that they will govern democratically when they go into office? Going back to the question of leadership, there are different theories of leadership. You have charismatic leaders, or charismatic theory of leadership, that leaders who are likable, right, they are able to appeal to the public, will get a following. There is also technocratic theories of leadership, leaders that are perceived to be competent, they can deliver, and so on and so forth. So there are different theories of leadership, but in Africa, especially in African politics, theories of leadership is different, particularly in Kenya. We've talked about politics of identity or ethnicity, if you will. In Kenya, leaders emerge if you are able to articulate most fiercely the interest of your tribe, quote unquote, the mountain, the valley, or the lake. If you are able to articulate and appear to be the most fierce defender and protector of the interest of your tribe, and you're able to rally the tribe behind you, then you emerge as the leader. So what does that tell us about the emergence of leadership? Is this person necessarily going to govern in the interest of the whole nation, or will they actually govern in the interest of the ethnicity through which they emerged into leadership? So you have all these, you have this Western model of understanding leadership and the African realities of understanding how leadership. And if these are the systems that produce and nurture leaders, we then perpetually will have bad leaders. And that is probably why we have poor governance on the African continent.
Victor asked a very good question, Daktari. Why don't you have good leadership in opposition?
In the opposition, because opposition does not occupy a vacuum. They are part and parcel of our political culture. So we have a pervasive political culture of patronage, ethnicity, clientelism, and lately, as we have seen in the US, it's now billionaires, Elon Musk and Trump, governing And Elon has been given this carte blanche to basically destroy the civil service as it is and recreate it in the image of Trump. In Kenya, politics has become so expensive that it is now the preserve of a few, probably the most corrupt or the most wealthy or the so-called dynasties, right? And Kenyans themselves as citizens have developed a culture of worshipping the big man syndrome. The more money you have, the more glorified you become. If you're a poor person, you're considered not fit to lead anyone, right? Because they argue, if you can't make something of yourself, how will you make something of the rest of us? So we have this corrupted culture that's corrupted our political system, that whether it is the opposition or in government, we have a political system that is so corrupt that it can only produce bad leaders. I'm afraid to be so pessimistic.
Okay. So looking ahead, what should African leaders do? Victor?
I think we need to redesign our definition of leadership. It's important to redefine. I appreciate what Prof has said, that you find that the person who best articulates their tribal interest or the interests of their ethnic group is the person who's considered a leader. And maybe I can extend that to mean the person who is able to garner the most votes is automatically a leader, whether or not they have portfolio. For example,
What is the portfolio of a leader?
Yes, exactly. So
what is the portfolio of a leader?
Well, it varies from situation to situation. I think that this is the question that Kenyans are grappling with. If you go to social media and Gen Zs, they're saying that we want the former Chief Justice, for example, or maybe Okia Omtata, or the champions of justice, human rights, equity, and all that. But when it comes to election day, these people will receive hardly any votes. Patrick Lumumba, Professor Lumumba tried to run one time. He almost got no votes. Our activist Mwangi tried to run. He got almost no votes. So Kenyans also then have this, they know the qualities of a good leader, but they don't actually vote. So their voting does not reflect what they say. So this is then the challenge. So leaders know how Kenyans think. And so they profile themselves and basically mold themselves in the image that Kenyans want rather than how Kenyans think.
But I think the dissonance is mainly because of the culture. The political culture that we have had with the older generation is mtuwetu. We vote for our person.
Yes.
So even when we are looking for a good governor, we must find a good governor who is our person. Even though we have got a good governor who is not our person, who was born and bred in that county, we will not vote for him. And same thing with government and PS, CSS positions. I think when we restructure leadership, what we need to start looking at is, what are the qualifications of a good governor or good governance? I'm using the word governor broadly. A good president, what are the qualifications? If you were looking for a good CEO, you're going to choose from good CEOs. You're going to choose from good operations managers. The first question you'll ask the CEO of an engineering firm is, have you done engineering? So it's normally very easy out there because you look at the skill set that the person has and you match it to the job. Politics is one of the most interesting animals where the skill set that you use to get the job is not the skill set that you use to run the office. So to get the job, you need to be eloquent, you need to be interesting, you need to garner votes, you need to move from place to place and get people to vote for you. But that doesn't work once you're in office. Once you're in office, you need to build something. You need long-term plans, medium-term plans. You need to manage people, manage resources, financial accounting, inspiring people and running various ministries and portfolios. Most of the guys who get into government don't have that skill set. So you've got politicians governing a country. And then we're asking ourselves, why do we have bad leaders? Because we elected an eloquent person to fly a plane. But you don't need eloquence to fly a plane. But this is changing. I think it's changing because when you look at the Gen Z movement, as much as we can't palpably see what they did, I think it made a big difference because the question that they were asking is, you told us that you are going to lower the cost of living. The cost of living has not gone up. and we are going to put our votes where our mouth is. Now, that is a conversation this country has not had, because we have always talked about my people will not vote for you because of X, Y, Z. I think it's a bit early, but it's possible that in the next elections, you're probably going to see in Kenya a change. You're going to see some old guards probably coming out when the Gen Zs put their votes where their mouth is. And I think this is emblematic of Africa. It is the same thing happening in the Sahel. You've got these young presidents who are saying, listen, you've been here too long. We need fresh blood. I'm coming in. And they actually walk into power. And they're making drastic changes on things that we were used to. They're changing currencies. They're changing, they're leaning from the west to the east. And they're doing it unapologetically. So I think that political culture is probably going to change, but I guess time is what will tell.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So our electoral board is failing us, Daktari, as we conclude the bulletin.
Election board?
Yes.
I would say it's not so much the election board, because they referee the process at the end. The rot in our Kenyan political system is not so much at the election, but the process leading up to the election. And I'll go back to political parties. In an ideal system, political parties are the institutions through which politicians are nurtured. Let me say leaders rather than politicians. Leaders are nurtured, identified, wanachujwa, to use a Swahili word, so that the best possible candidates who can govern in the interest of the country emerge through these political parties. And those are the ones we put on the ballot. Unless and until the day when political parties play their true role as the institutions through which we nurture, identify, and select good leaders for our country, we will always get trash out of these systems, because the systems themselves are trash, and we will continue getting bad leadership. So I favor the thinking that we need to invest in institution building, and particularly political parties, but also changing our political culture. So I have a glimmer of hope that the mass movement of Gen Zs may influence the political culture, shape the emergence of good leaders in political parties, and hopefully we will have good candidates.
Thank you so much. And that's all for today's At the African In-Depth in The Ambassador. Thank you for joining us as we covered latest development. We'll continue to bring you updates. Thank you and have a blessed afternoon.